So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Somewhere in the last week or two, your body did something that you had absolutely no say in. It picked a moment, and it was almost certainly an inconvenient one, and it made a sound, a small, sharp, faintly ridiculous sound. And then, about 5 seconds later, it made that sound again and again. And there was nothing you could do about it except wait. Maybe someone nearby handed you a glass of water and told you, with total confidence, that you had to drink it from the far side. Maybe someone tried to startle you, badly, in a way that fooled nobody. Maybe you just sat there and let it run its course, slightly embarrassed, waiting for your own body to finish whatever it had decided to do. You didn't choose that. Nobody taught you how to do it. There was no afternoon in your childhood when somebody sat you down and explained the mechanism, the way you were eventually taught to tie a shoelace or ride a bicycle. It simply arrived one day, fully formed, already knowing exactly what it was doing. And it has been arriving ever since, at random, without warning, for your entire life. It will keep arriving until the end of it. And here's the part that I think is genuinely worth lying here and turning over slowly. Almost nobody can tell you what it's for. Now, we're actually very good at explaining the body. That's the thing. We can tell you why you sweat and why you shiver and what those two processes are trying to achieve. We can tell you what a cough is doing and what a sneeze is doing, and why your eyes water when you cut an onion, and why your mouth fills with saliva when you smell food cooking. We can tell you why your pupils narrow in bright light and why your skin puckers after a long bath. So why doesn't this one? What is it doing there? Picture any one of them happening. Every single one of those has a job. Every one of them is your body noticing a problem and solving it. A cough clears your airway. A sneeze expels something that got in where it shouldn't be. Shivering generates heat by making your muscles work without your permission. Sweating sheds heat by putting water on your skin and letting it evaporate. Even yawning, which we understand less well than people assume, has several serious competing explanations, all of which involve it doing something useful. And that pattern is so consistent that we barely notice it as a pattern. Your body is, among other things, an enormous collection of automatic solutions to problems you never consciously registered having. Something touches your eye and the lid shuts before you've perceived the object. You step on something sharp and your leg is already lifting before the pain arrives. You stand up too quickly and a dozen adjustments happen in your blood vessels to stop you fainting, none of which you authorized. Everything has a reason. Everything is answering something. But this one doesn't clear anything. It doesn't warn you about anything. It doesn't protect you or cool you or expel anything or prepare you for anything. As far as anyone has been able to demonstrate, in over a century of looking, it achieves nothing at all, and yet it is older than you. It is older than your species. It is shared by every mammal alive on this planet right now, from the whale to the mouse. And it was almost certainly happening long before any of them existed in the form we'd recognize. And that combination is genuinely unusual. Because evolution is not sentimental. Traits that cost something and deliver nothing tend to erode over long enough stretches of time, not because anything decides to remove them, but because there's nothing holding them in place. Random change accumulates, and without any pressure to preserve it, a useless feature slowly blurs and fades and eventually stops working at all. Cave fish lose their eyes that way. Flightless birds lose the machinery of flight. So a reflex that does nothing should, in principle, be on its way out. Instead, this one is intact, precise, present in every mammal, and coordinated to within a few hundredths of a second. So what is it doing there? Why has nothing removed it? And why, after all the time people have spent looking, can nobody say with confidence what it is for? That's the puzzle. A reflex with no job that refuses to disappear. And tonight, we're going to take that puzzle apart very slowly, in the order that makes it easiest to understand. We'll start with the mechanism, because almost everything people believe about what physically happens is slightly wrong, and the truth is stranger and simpler than the folklore. We'll meet the two nerves responsible and follow the absurd, wandering routes they take through the middle of your body. And you'll find out why the list of things that set you off is not random at all. We'll go a very long way back, into deep time and into water, and look at two competing explanations for where this thing came from, both of which are still argued about by serious people. We'll find out that you were doing this before you had lungs that worked. Then we'll come back to the surface. We'll spend some time with a farmer in Iowa who started hiccuping in 1922 and did not stop for 68 years. We'll look at the doctors who tried, sometimes with alarming creativity, to make it stop, and at the single most undignified paper in the medical literature, which happens to also be one of the most quietly correct. And we'll take every folk cure you've ever been told, the water and the sugar and the paper bag and the fright, and we'll sort them out and find which ones are nonsense and which ones are accidentally, beautifully right. And I should say now, before we start, that a lot of this is unresolved, not vague, not fringe, just genuinely unfinished. There are places tonight where the honest answer is that two groups of serious researchers disagree, and a third group thinks both of them are asking the wrong question. I'm going to tell you when we reach those places, rather than smoothing them over, because I think the uncertainty is the most interesting part. It's a strange thing to discover that something this ordinary, something that happens to every person you have ever met, still has open questions sitting in the middle of it. We'll take it slowly. There's no hurry at all. Nothing here needs to be remembered, and nothing here is going to demand anything from you. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that's rather the point. One more thing before we go. None of this requires you to follow it closely. There's no argument being built here that falls apart if you miss a section, and no point later on where you'll need to remember something from earlier. It's a story told in order, and it's perfectly happy to be listened to at half attention. If you fall asleep in the middle of it, the story keeps going without you. That's rather the arrangement. So let's begin where it actually begins, which is with a sheet of muscle you have never once thought about, doing something that takes less than 1/10 of a second. Underneath your lungs, stretched across the bottom of your rib cage like the skin of a drum, there is a large flat muscle. It's an unusual muscle, and it's worth understanding why. Picture a muscle, any muscle, and what does your mind produce? Almost certainly something long and thin, attached at both ends. That isn't this one at all. Most of the muscles in your body work by pulling two bones toward each other. Your bicep pulls your forearm up, your calf pulls your heel down. They're ropes, essentially, anchored at both ends, and when they shorten, something moves. This one doesn't work like that at all. It's a dome. It curves upward into your chest, pushing up underneath your lungs like a hand pressing into the bottom of a balloon. And when it contracts, it doesn't pull anything toward anything. It just flattens. And when it flattens, the space above it gets bigger. And when that space gets bigger, the pressure inside it drops below the pressure of the air in the room. And air comes rushing in through your nose and mouth to fill the difference. That's it. That's breathing. That's the whole thing. And how much does that muscle actually move? Less than you'd guess. In an ordinary resting breath, the diaphragm travels somewhere around 1 to 2 centimeters. In a deep one, it can manage 7 or more. A couple of centimeters, 12 to 20 times a minute, 20,000 or so times a day, for as long as you exist. It is the most quietly hard-working piece of equipment you own. And when it relaxes again, it curves back up into its dome, the space shrinks, the pressure rises, and the air goes back out. In, out, a muscle changing shape, and a room changing size around it. Take one now, if you like. Not a deep one, just an ordinary one. And pay attention to what actually moves. Most people, if they've never thought about it, assume breathing happens in the chest, that the ribs do the work, and the lungs pull the air in like a pair of bellows deciding to open. But your lungs have no muscles of their own. They can't pull anything. They're passive bags that get stretched by the space around them. And the thing doing the stretching is sitting underneath, quietly, doing its shape change over and over. The muscle is called the diaphragm, and you have used it somewhere in the region of 600 million times, and you have thought about almost none of them. It's doing it right now, underneath this sentence, while your attention is somewhere else entirely. It'll keep doing it all night, at a slightly slower rate, while you're not there to supervise now. A hiccup is that same muscle doing that same motion at the wrong moment and far too fast. Instead of the smooth, unhurried flattening of an ordinary breath, the diaphragm jerks. A single hard involuntary contraction, sudden enough that the muscles between your ribs often join in. Air rushes into your windpipe at speed. So where does the sound come from? Not from the muscle. Muscles are silent. And then the second half happens. And the second half is what makes the noise. At the top of your windpipe, there's a structure called the larynx. Inside it are your vocal cords. and the gap between them is called the glottis. It's a valve, and you use it constantly without noticing. It's what closes when you lift something heavy and brace yourself. It's what closes when you swallow so that your dinner goes down the correct tube instead of the one that leads to your lungs. In a hiccup, that valve doesn't close. It slams, and it slams fast. Roughly 35 thousandths of a second after the diaphragm fires, about 300ths of a second, far, far faster than you could ever close it deliberately, no matter how hard you tried or how much you practiced. So picture what you now have. A column of air rushing upward through a narrow tube at speed, and a heavy door swinging shut directly in front of it. Nothing gets through. Nothing was ever going to. The air hits the closed door, hic. There's an experiment you can run on yourself in a small way that gets you close to the sensation without the involuntary part. Take a very quick, sharp sip of air, as fast as you possibly can, and then close your throat hard at the end of it. You'll get something in the neighborhood, a truncated little gulp, and it will sound almost right and feel almost right and be, in every important respect, wrong. The timing is off by an order of magnitude. What you just did took you 1/10 of a second at best. The real thing does it in 1/3 of that, without asking, without preparation, and with a consistency you could never reproduce. That's the sound. That's all of it. It isn't coming from your throat exactly, and it certainly isn't coming from your stomach, whatever you may have been told. It's the eerie, clipped noise of a very fast inhale being stopped dead by a valve that had no business closing. And the reason it's so recognizable, the reason you can identify it instantly from another room, through a wall, in a language you don't speak, is that almost nothing else your body produces has that shape. Most bodily sounds are made by air moving through something. A cough, a laugh, a sigh, a word, airflow across tissue. This one is made by air being stopped, which gives it that abrupt, clipped quality, like a note cut off before it finishes. It's a sound with no tail. It starts and ends in the same instant, which means, if you follow it through, that a hiccup is a breath that was started and then refused. And there's a detail buried in there that almost everybody misses. And it's the detail that turns this from a curiosity into a genuine mystery, because that valve closes so quickly and so completely. Essentially, no air moves. None. There's no useful intake of oxygen. There's no expulsion of anything. The event is functionally sealed off at both ends. It is a full-scale breathing motion. With the breathing surgically removed, your body committed a hard muscular contraction, involved several muscle groups, coordinated the timing to within 300ths of a second, and moved no air whatsoever. What would you even call that? A mistake? It's far too precise to be a mistake. A performance? For whom? And it isn't as though the timing is sloppy. That's what makes it so odd. If the glottis closed a fraction of a second later, you'd get a genuine gulp of air. If it closed a fraction earlier, you'd get almost no contraction at all. Instead, it lands in the one narrow window where the muscle has already committed and the airway is already sealed which is the only arrangement that produces exactly nothing. Whatever this circuit is doing, it is doing it precisely. Consider how strange that is. Why would anything be built to do that? Sit with that for a moment, because it's going to matter later. Everything else your body does that looks like this achieves something. The cough moves air violently. The sneeze moves air more violently still. The sigh, the yawn, the gasp, the laugh, they all move air. This one goes through the entire performance and then cancels it at the last possible instant and gets nothing out of it. And if it were just one badly timed spasm, one twitch, one misfire, we could stop here and call it a glitch and go to sleep. But it isn't one. It comes back. And it comes back on a schedule, because here's the second odd thing. And it's the one that changes what kind of problem this is. Hiccups have a tempo. They're not random. If you pay attention next time, and I suspect you will now, you'll notice that they arrive at intervals, and the intervals are remarkably even. Most people sit somewhere between 4 and 60 a minute, and there's a lot of variation between individuals. 4 a minute is a slow, spaced out, almost peaceful version, 1 every 15 seconds, easy enough to talk through. 60 a minute is 1 per second, relentlessly, and that version is genuinely difficult to live with for even an hour. Most ordinary episodes sit somewhere comfortably in the middle and last a few minutes and end without ceremony while you're thinking about something else. But within a single episode, in a single person, the spacing stays almost eerily consistent. If yours are 5 seconds apart, they will tend to keep being 5 seconds apart for as long as the episode lasts. You could set a metronome by them. People have. There's an old and slightly grim way this was studied. Before there were convenient methods of recording it, some researchers simply sat with patients who had long-running episodes and counted with a watch for hours. What they found was that the interval could shift slowly over the course of a day, drifting a little faster or a little slower, but it almost never jumped. It moved the way a tide moves rather than the way a light switch moves. And that regularity tells you something important, because randomness and rhythm are produced by completely different kinds of machinery. Rotmanness means noise. What does rhythm mean? And what does a rhythm imply? A rhythm means something is generating a beat and repeating it, and your body has a specific piece of equipment for exactly that. They're called central pattern generators, and they are small circuits of neurons, mostly living in your brain stem and spinal cord, that produce repeating output entirely on their own. They don't need instructions from your conscious brain to keep going. They just run. You already rely on several of these constantly. The rhythm of ordinary breathing is one of them, which is why you don't have to remember to breathe. The rhythm of walking is another, which is why your legs will keep alternating without you narrating each step. Chewing has one. Swallowing has one. These circuits are old and they're remarkably robust, and they can be studied in isolation. Researchers have taken sections of nervous tissue from simple animals, disconnected them entirely from the brain and from any sensory input, and watched them go on producing their rhythm anyway, into nothing, like a music box that keeps playing after the room has emptied. The rhythm doesn't come from outside. It's built into the arrangement of the cells themselves, in loops of excitation and inhibition that feed each other and reset each other over and over. That's the kind of machinery we're dealing with here. Not a wire that shorted, a generator that started. So this changes the picture entirely. A hiccup is not a glitch in the sense of a random electrical stutter. Something switches a circuit on, and while that circuit is on, it runs on a loop at a set tempo until something switches it off. There's a useful way to feel the difference. Think about a hiccup that stops. It doesn't fade out, getting weaker and further apart until it dwindles into nothing. It usually just ends. You get one, and then you wait for the next one, and it doesn't come, and after 20 or 30 seconds, you realize it's over. A dying twitch would taper. A program terminates. It's not a malfunction. It's a program. And what starts the program? What flips the switch? That's the question everything else tonight is going to be built on. So let's go and find out what can reach it. And there's a strange little wrinkle in that program, which I want to plant now and then leave alone, because it becomes important much later on. The loop can be slowed down. There is a well-documented relationship between hiccup frequency and the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood. As carbon dioxide rises, hiccups tend to become less frequent. That's a real, measurable, physiological connection, and it has been known for a long time. Why would breathing less make a hiccup less frequent? Hold that question. We are not ready for it. Hold on to that. Don't do anything with it. It's going to turn out to be the hidden logic underneath, about half of everything your grandmother told you, and we'll come back to it properly when we've earned it. Now, while we're here, let's slow down for a minute and talk about the word, because the words we use for this are strange in their own right, and they tell you something about how people have always heard it. And people have been writing about this for a very long time indeed. The oldest surviving description of a hiccup cure is roughly 2,400 years old, and it's in Plato. In the Symposium, a dinner party where a group of Athenians are taking turns making speeches about love, the comic playwright Aristophanes gets the hiccups and cannot deliver his. He turns to the physician in the room, a man named Eryximachus, and asks him what to do. And Eryximachus gives him 3 suggestions. Hold your breath, gargle with water, or, if neither of those works, tickle your nose until you sneeze. Think about that for a second. 2,400 years ago, at a party in Athens, a doctor gave advice that is, mechanically, almost exactly what a doctor would give you today. Hold your breath, which raises carbon dioxide. Gargle, which stimulates the throat. Provoke a sneeze, which resets the breathing rhythm entirely. He had no idea why any of it worked. He had no concept of a nerve as we understand one. And he was right 3 times out of 3. The medical name is singultus. It comes from Latin, and it doesn't mean anything comic. It means a sob, a gasp, the catch in the voice when someone is crying and trying to speak at the same time. which is a rather beautiful and slightly sad origin for something we treat as a joke. Whoever chose that word heard it honestly. To them, it wasn't a funny noise from a cartoon. It was the sound of a person being interrupted by their own chest. And what about our word? The English one is much less dignified. Hiccup is what linguists call an imitative word, or onomatopoeia. The word is simply the sound written down by somebody who heard it and did their best. There's no elegant etymology hiding behind it. It's a transcription. And then, at some point around the 16th or 17th century, somebody looked at that word and decided it ought to be spelled Hiccoughh, hiccup, presumably on the theory that this was some variety of cough. It is not a cough. It has nothing whatsoever to do with coughing. A cough is an explosive exhale designed to clear the airway. A hiccup is a cancelled inhale that clears nothing. They are, mechanically, almost opposites. But the spelling stuck anyway, because spellings do, and you can still find it sitting in older books and dictionaries, being confidently wrong for 400 years. It's one of my favorite small examples of how strangely language works. Somebody made an assumption, wrote it down, and now it's furniture. And nearly every other language did the same imitative thing, independently. The French say hoke, the Spanish say hippo, the Germans say schluckauf, the Japanese say shakuri. Different grammar, different histories, entirely unrelated language families in some cases, separated by continents and centuries. And all of them listened to the same small sound and reached for more or less the same handful of hard consonants. And you can see people reaching for the same trick in the way we name other involuntary noises: sneeze, hiss, gurgle, burp, whimper. When the body makes a sound of its own accord, language tends to give up on describing it and just imitates it instead, which is a small reminder that words are not always designed. Sometimes they're just what got repeated most often until everyone agreed. Notice what that tells you. That's a quiet but genuinely good piece of evidence for just how universal this is. Every group of human beings that ever developed a language had to invent a word for this, because every group of human beings was doing it constantly. In every generation, everywhere on earth, there's one more thing about that rhythm that's worth knowing, and it's a gentle one. The tempo of a hiccup episode tends to sit fairly close to the tempo of a slow, resting heartbeat. Not identical and not causally connected as far as anyone can tell, but in the same neighborhood. Somewhere between one every second and one every few seconds. Which means that if you have ever found the sound of it oddly, annoyingly regular, that's why. It's arriving at roughly the pace your body already keeps time at. Most of what your body does happens at rhythms in that same slow range. The heart, the breath, the long, quiet cycles of digestion. You are, mechanically speaking, a fairly unhurried machine. So where does that leave us? We now know what it is. We know it's a program rather than an accident. We know something is switching that program on. Which means the next question is, what's reaching the switch? And to find that out, we have to follow the wires. And the wires, and I mean this sincerely, are one of the best things in this entire story, because they do not go where any reasonable person would expect. Let's start with the one that gives the order. Somewhere in your nervous system, there has to be a cable running to the diaphragm. Something has to carry the instruction that says contract. That's not optional. Every muscle you have needs a nerve telling it what to do. Now, imagine for a moment that you're the one designing this. You have a muscle to control and a spinal cord to run a wire from. Where would you put it? Take a moment and actually picture the problem before I tell you the answer. The diaphragm sits in the middle of your torso, roughly at the bottom of your rib cage. So the obvious answer is that its nerve should leave the spinal cord somewhere nearby, at about that height, travel a few inches sideways, and arrive. Short, direct, sensible. The way the wiring in a well-built house runs from the nearest junction box rather than from the other end of the street, that is not what happens. Not remotely. The nerve that controls your diaphragm is called the phrenic nerve, and it leaves your spinal cord in your neck, not near your neck, in it. It emerges from the third, fourth, and fifth cervical vertebrae, up at about the level of your throat, roughly in line with your Adam's apple. And from there it sets off downward, traveling the entire length of your neck, through your chest, past your lungs, right alongside the sac that surrounds your heart, until at last it arrives at a muscle that is nowhere near where it started. We have known about this nerve for an extraordinarily long time, incidentally. Galen, the Greek physician who worked in Rome in the 2nd century, identified it and understood that cutting it stopped the diaphragm. He worked this out by experiment on animals, roughly 1800 years before anybody could explain what a nerve actually was. And the vagus, which we'll come to shortly, was described in detail by Thomas Willis, an English physician working in Oxford in the 1660s, who gave us the word neurology and who mapped the cranial nerves with a precision that still holds up. So the anatomy in this story is old and settled and beautifully documented. It's only the behavior that nobody can explain. It's a remarkable piece of routing, and it has a genuinely profound consequence. Medical students memorize it with a rhyme because it matters enormously and because it's easy to forget. C3, 4, 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. Why does a rhyme exist for it at all? Because the consequences of forgetting it are enormous, and that little rhyme carries real weight. It's the reason the exact height of a neck injury can be the difference between two completely different lives. Damage the spinal cord above that point, and the signal to the diaphragm never leaves. Breathing stops on its own, permanently, and can only continue with machines. Damage it a few centimeters lower, and the phrenic nerve is still connected, and the person keeps breathing unaided for the rest of their life. The arms may be affected, the hands, the whole body below the injury, but the breath continues because the wire left the building before the damage happened. An inch of spinal cord decides that. 1 inch. There is one more oddity to it too. Because you have two of these nerves, one on each side, and they supply the two halves of the diaphragm separately, which means it is entirely possible and does happen for one half of the diaphragm to be paralyzed while the other continues working normally. People live like that. They tire more easily. They struggle lying flat, but they breathe. It also means that a hiccup is often not symmetrical. In many people, the left side of the diaphragm contracts harder than the right during an episode, which is a small thing but a genuinely strange one. Somewhere in the brainstem, a circuit is favoring one side of your body over the other, for reasons nobody has satisfactorily explained. I find that fact difficult to put down. There's a great deal in the body that has redundancy built in, backups and workarounds and second routes. This has almost none. One long cable, running an absurd distance, and everything depends on it. Now hold on to the geography, because it's going to explain a great deal in a few minutes. That nerve is long, very long, and it passes through some of the busiest real estate in your entire body. It runs beside major blood vessels. It runs past the membrane around your heart. It runs alongside the lungs. It threads through the region where your neck becomes your chest, which is crowded with structures, all of which are moving all of the time. Think about what actually surrounds it on that journey. The great vessels leaving the heart, the membrane wrapped around the heart itself, which the phrenic nerve runs directly along, so closely that inflammation of that membrane is a classic cause of persistent hiccups. The lungs on either side, the oesophagus, carrying everything you swallow several times a day past the same corridor. Lymph nodes, the thyroid, up at the top, a dense, packed, constantly moving neighborhood, and one long, fragile wire running straight through the middle of it from top to bottom. A nerve that long, running through territory that crowded, has an enormous number of opportunities to be disturbed. Anything that swells, presses, inflames, stretches, or irritates anywhere along that route is touching a cable that runs to the muscle that breathes for you. And I want to be honest with you here, because there's an obvious question sitting in the middle of this, and I'm deliberately not answering it yet. Why would a body be built this way? Why would the wire start in the neck? There is an answer. It's a very good answer, and it's one of the best moments in this whole story. And it isn't a coincidence or an accident of anatomy textbooks, but it will land much harder once you've met the second nerve. So we're going to leave it standing there, unanswered for a little while, because there are two nerves involved in this, not one. The phrenic nerve gives the order. Something else carries the complaint. That distinction matters more than it might sound. A reflex is never a single wire. It's a circuit, and a circuit needs a way in as well as a way out. Something has to notice, something has to decide, and something has to act. So far, we only have the acting. We have the muscle and the cable that fires it. We have no explanation at all for what starts it, and no candidate for what does the noticing. For that, we need a nerve with reach. Something that touches enough of you to pick up a complaint from almost anywhere. And if the first nerve took an odd route, the second one barely bothers with the concept of routes at all. And if you've only just drifted back in, you haven't missed much that matters. We're following two nerves through the body. The first one runs the muscle. This is the second one. Its name is the vagus nerve, and the name is the first clue. Vagus is Latin for wandering. It's the same root that gives us vagrant and vagabond and vague. And whoever named it was not exaggerating in the slightest, because this nerve wanders in a way that no other nerve in your body does. It begins in the brainstem, at the base of the skull. It comes down through the neck. It enters the chest. It passes the heart and the lungs and sends branches to both. It continues down into the abdomen. It touches the stomach. It touches the esophagus. It reaches the intestines, the liver, parts of the colon. Picture it as a river with tributaries rather than a wire. It is by far the longest of the cranial nerves, and it goes almost everywhere that matters. To give you a sense of what it's responsible for, the vagus is a major part of the reason your heart rate slows when you're calm. It's involved in the movement of food through your digestive system. It contributes to the production of stomach acid, to the reflex that makes you swallow, to the muscles of your voice box, and therefore to your ability to speak. It plays a role in the cough reflex. If you have ever fainted at the sight of something unpleasant, that was your vagus nerve overreacting and dropping your heart rate and blood pressure at the same moment. One nerve. All of that. And unlike the phrenic nerve, which is essentially a one-way instruction cable, the vagus runs in both directions at once. It carries commands down to your organs, telling them to slow or speed or squeeze or secrete. And it carries information back up, reporting what those organs are doing and how they feel about it. It is, in the most literal sense, the beautifully direct cable along which your gut and your brain gossip about each other. When you say you have a gut feeling, you are describing, with more accuracy than you probably intended, traffic on the vagus nerve. So what happens when something disturbs it? Now we can assemble the whole circuit. Something irritates a sensory branch somewhere in the body, usually vagal, sometimes phrenic, sometimes from the sympathetic supply running from the upper spine. That irritation sends a signal upward, and the signal arrives at a region of the brainstem and upper spinal cord that researchers call the hiccup center. And the hiccup center, having received the complaint, issues a two-part command back down the line. Fire the diaphragm. Close the glottis. Now, I have to be straightforward with you about that hiccup center, because I've just used a very confident-sounding term for something that is not well understood at all. It has a name and it appears in diagrams, and researchers refer to it constantly. But it has never been precisely mapped. Nobody can point to a specific cluster of cells and say, there, that's the one. It's defined more by what it does than by where it is. And there's a real consequence to that, which is that treating it is difficult. It's hard to switch off a circuit when you cannot say with confidence which cells belong to it. Almost everything we do about hiccups, as we'll see, works by interfering with the inputs or the outputs rather than the circuit itself, because the inputs and the outputs are things we can actually find. Part of the difficulty is that this region sits in an extremely crowded and extremely delicate part of the nervous system, tangled in among the circuits that run breathing, swallowing, heart rate, blood pressure, and vomiting, all packed into a space roughly the size of your thumb. You cannot go poking around in there to see what does what. Most of what's known has been assembled indirectly from animal studies, from the effects of strokes and injuries that happen to damage one small area and not another, and from a great deal of careful inference. That's worth knowing, because it's a pattern that runs through this entire subject. The further in you go, the more you find things that are named more confidently than they are understood. But we know enough to do something useful, because now, with that map in front of us, the list of things that trigger hiccups stops looking like superstition and starts looking like geography. So think about the things that set people off. And as I list them, notice whether you recognize your own eating too fast, which stretches the stomach, which pulls on the vagus nerve wrapped around and through it, fizzy drinks, which do exactly the same thing from the inside, using gas instead of food, a large meal, especially a hot one, especially eaten quickly. Same mechanism, more of it. Alcohol, which is close to purpose-built for this. It relaxes the valve at the top of the stomach, which lets acid rise into the esophagus, where the vagus is waiting. Sudden changes of temperature, a very cold drink, very hot food, cold air hitting your neck. All of them are strong, abrupt sensory input in exactly the territory these nerves occupy. Heartburn and reflux for the same reason, but slower and more persistent. Swallowing air, which people do constantly without realizing, while laughing or talking with their mouth full or chewing gum or smoking. And anxiety and excitement and stress, which alter the breathing rhythm that this whole system is riding on top of. Some medications too, which we'll come back to properly, because that turns out to matter far more than most people realize. And, for a certain number of people, no identifiable trigger whatsoever. It simply starts, which is its own kind of information, and we'll come back to that as well. Notice the pattern. Every single item on that list is a mechanical or chemical nudge somewhere along the route of a nerve that had no business being that long in the first place. And once you've seen the map, you can predict things you were never told. Why a cold beer on a hot day is worse than a warm one. Why the hiccups tend to come at the end of the meal rather than the start, once the stomach has actually filled. Why they show up at weddings and parties and family dinners, where people eat quickly, drink fizzy things, talk while chewing, laugh with their mouths full, and get emotionally worked up all at once for several hours. That isn't bad luck. That's about 6 different triggers being pulled simultaneously in a room full of people. It was never random. It only looked random because nobody showed you the map. And there's one more branch of the vagus I want to mention now, because it's small and strange, and it becomes one of the best stories in this entire video. Quite a bit later on, a branch of the vagus nerve supplies part of your ear canal, the skin inside your ear. That's why some people cough when a doctor examines their ear with an otoscope. It seems like nonsense, an ear connected to a throat reflex. But it's simply the same cable arriving somewhere unexpected. Why would an ear be wired into a throat reflex? Because the same wandering cable arrives in both places, and it does not label its branches. Remember that. A branch of the vagus goes to the ear. We'll need it later, and when we do, it's going to explain something genuinely remarkable. So here's where that leaves us tonight. Before we go any further back, this keeps happening to you over and over throughout your life, because two of the most important nerves in your body take long, indirect, historically peculiar journeys through the middle of you. And they pass on the way straight through the one region that you spend all day, every day, filling with food and drink and gas and acid and air. Imagine trying to design it this way on purpose. You would have to run one control cable from the throat down to the middle of the torso, and a second sensory cable from the base of the skull all the way to the intestines. And then you would have to route both of them directly through the one part of the body that fills and empties several times a day. Nobody would do that. Nobody would sign that off. You are not being singled out. You are simply the owner of some very badly routed wiring. And everyone you know has exactly the same wiring, laid out in exactly the same peculiar way, which is why this is one of the very few experiences that is genuinely universal. Not common, universal. There is no population anywhere on earth that doesn't do this. No group that evolved out of it. No lucky family line that was spared. Every person who has ever lived has stood somewhere mid-sentence and been interrupted by their own chest. That's a strange kind of company to keep. Everybody who ever was. Which brings us back at last to the question I've been putting off. Why is it built this way? And the answer to that isn't in your body at all. It's behind your body. Several 100 million years behind it. Here's a fact that sounds like a party trick, but is straightforwardly, unremarkably true. Your diaphragm and your neck used to be in the same place. Very early in your development, long before you looked anything like a person, the tissue that would eventually become your diaphragm formed up near what would eventually become your neck. It started life as a small collection of cells in the upper part of a body that hadn't decided on its final proportions yet. And at that stage, the nerve supply arrived exactly where you'd want it to. Short, local, sensible. The wire and the muscle were neighbors, and then the embryo grew. The chest cavity expanded. The heart and the lungs claimed their space, and the developing diaphragm migrated downward, sliding into position beneath them, settling into the place where you now carry it. But it didn't leave its nerve behind, and it didn't get a new one. It dragged the old one along with it. So how does a wire end up somewhere so obviously wrong? Picture moving an appliance from one end of a house to the other without unplugging it. You don't rewire the building. You don't fit a new socket. You just pull, and the cord follows, stretching out behind the thing all the way back to the outlet it was originally plugged into. running along the skirting board, through doorways, across the hall, until it reaches the room where you actually want the appliance to be. That's the phrenic nerve. It isn't long because anything needs it to be long. It's long because it got stretched. The wire in your chest is a record of a journey your own tissue took in the dark, before you had a face, and it happened to you. Not to an ancestor, not to a species, to you specifically, in a process that took a few weeks and that you have no access to whatsoever. Every person listening to this has that stretched cord running down the inside of their chest, laid down in the same weeks, by the same process, for the same reason. And this isn't a rare event in development either. Quite a lot of you moved. The kidneys begin high in the abdomen and descend. The testes, in males, begin near the kidneys and travel down over months, which is why the vessels supplying them run such an improbably long course. The heart itself forms in what will become the neck region and drops into the chest, which is why the nerve looping around the arch of the aorta ends up taking a detour so absurd that in a giraffe it adds several meters to a journey of a few centimeters. Bodies are built by moving parts around inside a growing space, and the connections do not get renegotiated. They just stretch, and once you see that, a much larger idea opens up behind it. Because this isn't a quirk of one nerve. This is how bodies are built, everywhere, at every scale, and it explains a great deal about why we're such peculiar machines. So why does the body do this? Why not simply route the wire properly? So why would a body be built like that? Why would anything sensible run a wire that far? The answer is that nothing sensible did. Evolution does not design, it edits. Say that slowly, because everything else tonight rests on it. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because almost everybody's mental image of this is wrong in the same way. We tend to imagine evolution as a kind of slow engineer, gradually improving a product across generations, sanding off the rough edges, working towards something better. And that image gets the outcome roughly right while getting the process completely wrong. What can an engineer do that evolution cannot? An engineer can start again. An engineer can look at a design that's become a mess, throw the drawings away, and produce a clean second version that does the same job with half the parts. Evolution can never do that. It has no drawings, no second version, no ability to step back. It can only ever modify something that is already alive and already working. One small change at a time, and every single intermediate step has to survive. So it never removes a problem. It works around it. It adds a patch or a compensation or a longer cable, and whatever it produces gets passed on and built upon and patched again. And after a few 100 million years of that, you get a body full of arrangements that no sane designer would ever have chosen, all of which work, none of which are tidy. Your eye has a blind spot because the wiring runs across the front of the retina and has to punch a hole through it to get out the back. Your throat carries both your food and your air through the same corridor, which is why choking is possible at all. Your spine is a horizontal beam that was rotated 90 degrees and ask to become a vertical column, which is why so many people's backs eventually complain about it. Your appendix, your wisdom teeth, the muscles around your ears that in most people can no longer move anything, the tailbone at the base of your spine, all of it is the same story told in different parts of the body. Structures that meant something once, kept because keeping them was cheaper than losing them. None of that is bad design. It's the absence of design. It's the accumulated evidence of a very long history in which nothing was ever allowed to start over. And the phrenic nerve's ridiculous commute belongs in exactly that catalogue. It's a fossil you're carrying around inside your chest, still functioning, still doing its job perfectly well, and still following a route that only makes sense if you know where it used to live. There's a phrase used for this in evolutionary biology, and I like it because it's so unglamorous: historical constraint. It means, roughly, that what an organism can become is limited by what it already is. You can only edit the document in front of you. Every living thing is walking around inside the decisions of its ancestors, which brings us to a thought that I find genuinely difficult to shake once it arrives. If the wiring is inherited, then maybe the reflex is inherited too. Think about what that would mean. We've been assuming, quietly, that a hiccup is something your body does wrong, a misfire, a glitch in an otherwise well-run system. But if the anatomy involved is a leftover, then perhaps the behavior is a leftover as well. So what if we've had this backwards? What if it isn't a fault at all? Perhaps a hiccup isn't a malfunction of the human body at all. Perhaps it's a piece of much older equipment, still installed, still connected, still capable of running, occasionally switching itself on in a body that stopped needing it a very long time ago. That's the idea. And it's a good idea, and a lot of serious people have taken it seriously. But it splits almost immediately into two competing versions, which disagree with each other about something fundamental, and both of which are still live arguments today. One of them takes us into water. The other takes us somewhere much closer to home. Let's start with the water, because it's the older claim and the stranger one. And once you've seen it, you may find it difficult to unsee. The starting observations is this. If you look carefully at what a hiccup actually is, mechanically, as a motor pattern, it doesn't really resemble anything else that human beings do. We have a lot of reflexes involving the airway, and they mostly follow a family resemblance. A cough is a sharp exhale against a briefly closed airway. A sneeze is much the same, redirected. A throat clear, a gag, a retch. All of them are, in essence, ways of pushing something out. A hiccup does the opposite. It pulls in and then it seals. Contract, then close, in and then shut, which is, when you lay it out plainly, a strange order of operations for an animal that lives in air and needs every breath it takes. There is one partial exception, and it's worth mentioning because it shows how unusual the ordering is. The gasp, the sharp intake when you're startled or frightened, does pull in suddenly, but it doesn't seal afterward. It holds, and then it releases, and the air goes back out. And the whole point of it is that you've taken on a lungful in case you need it. The hiccup takes the breath and then throws it away. Nothing else you do goes in that order for no reason. And that's the anomaly that started people looking elsewhere for its origin. Because there is a creature that does exactly this, deliberately, as a matter of routine, thousands of times a day. Amphibian larvae, tadpoles, and some primitive fish. So what does a tadpole actually need to do? And why would it need to do this? Picture one for a moment. A tadpole in shallow water doing the only thing it does. Here's its problem. They have gills and they need water moving across those gills constantly because that's where they get their oxygen. But many of them are also developing lungs at the same time because they are going to need them later. And those developing lungs are connected to the same airway. So water going in must be routed across the gills and absolutely must not go down into the lungs. And the way they solve it is with a specific, repeated, two-part movement. Draw water in through the mouth by contracting the floor of the mouth and the muscles of the throat, and at that same moment, close the glottis. So the water is forced sideways across the gills instead of continuing downward, and they do it constantly. This isn't an occasional maneuver. It's the basic rhythm of their existence, repeated over and over, the way breathing is for you, because for them, it is breathing contact. Seal, the sequence is the same. The muscle groups involved are homologous, which is to say they descend from the same ancestral structures. And the nerves carrying the instructions are the same nerves we've been talking about all night. Consider how closely those line up. The correspondence is close enough that it makes people uncomfortable, in the productive way that good scientific observations often do. In 2003, a group of researchers in Paris, led by Christian Strauss, published a paper that took this observation, which had been floating around in various loose forms for a while, and gave it real anatomical and neurological teeth. Their argument was that the neural circuit driving gill ventilation was never deleted from the lineage that eventually produced us. It was conserved, tucked away in the brainstem, gradually suppressed, mostly overridden by the newer breathing machinery that replaced it, but not removed. And a hiccup in their reading is that ancient circuit briefly, pointlessly, coming back online in an animal that has no gills at all, which is a remarkable sentence to have to hold in your head at 11 o'clock at night. Picture it, if you like, something the size of your thumbnail in dark water 350 million years ago, pulling in and sealing shut over and over, and the same instruction, in the same order, arriving in your chest tonight. And there's a particular quality to that idea that I think is worth naming, because it's the reason this theory gets repeated so widely. It isn't just surprising, it's intimate. It suggests that something in you is older than your species, older than land, older than lungs, and that it occasionally speaks up. Whether or not it turns out to be true, you can see why people want it to be. When you hiccup, you may be running a program written for breathing underwater. I want to be fair to how good this theory is, because it is good. It explains the odd motor pattern, which was the thing that needed explaining. It explains why the reflex shows up in every mammal rather than being a human peculiarity. It explains why it accomplishes nothing useful now, because of course it wouldn't, since the thing it was designed to accomplish requires water and gills, neither of which you have. And it fits neatly with everything we've just said about how bodies are assembled out of leftovers. There's a further piece in its favor, too, which is developmental. The nerves and muscles involved in a hiccup are the ones that, in the developing embryo, arise from a particular set of early structures called the branchial or pharyngeal arches. And in fish, those very same arches become the gill apparatus. Same starting material, different destinations, which is quietly remarkable. So the hardware genuinely does trace back to the same place. Whatever you conclude about the behavior, it's elegant, it's tidy, it has the shape of a correct answer. So, is that the answer? Not quite. It has a weakness, and the weakness is serious, and honesty requires that we look at it directly rather than walking past it. The theory explains where the machinery came from. It does not explain why the machinery is still switched on. Remember what we said earlier. Useless things decay, not because anything decides to remove them, but because nothing is holding them in place. When a trait stops mattering, mutations accumulate in it freely, and over enough generations, it degrades, blurs, and eventually stops working. That's how cave-dwelling fish end up with eyes that don't see. That's how flightless birds end up with wings that can't lift them. So if this circuit genuinely has no function whatsoever, and hasn't had one for hundreds of millions of years, we should expect it to be a ruin by now. A vague, sloppy, inconsistent remnant, if it survived at all. Instead, it's precise. It fires a coordinated contraction and closes a valve within 35 thousandths of a second, reliably in every member of an entire class of animals, generation after generation, with no apparent drift. That is not what abandoned machinery looks like. That's what maintained machinery looks like. You can make an argument that the circuit is being preserved incidentally because it shares components with the breathing machinery, and you cannot degrade one without damaging the other. That's a real counter-argument, and it may well be correct. But it's a rescue rather than a prediction, which is generally a sign that a theory is under strain. Something has been keeping it sharp. And the gill theory, for all its elegance, has no good candidate for what. Which is why a second group of researchers went looking somewhere else entirely, not hundreds of millions of years back, about as far back as the first few weeks of your own life. So what could possibly be keeping it sharp? Imagine you needed a reason. What would it have to look like? Start with a problem that every mammal on Earth has had to solve, and solve well, or the whole arrangement fails immediately. Newborns feed on milk. That's the entire deal. That's what defines the group. And it comes with a set of engineering constraints that are genuinely difficult. The infant has to take liquid continuously from a source that keeps delivering it. It has to swallow that liquid quickly and repeatedly without pausing. It absolutely cannot inhale any of it because inhaling milk into developing lungs is dangerous and can be fatal. And unavoidably, while doing all of this, it swallows air, a lot of air. Air goes down with every mouthful, and it collects at the top of the stomach. And that trapped air is a real problem, not a minor inconvenience. It takes up volume. A stomach with a pocket of gas sitting in the top of it cannot hold as much milk. The infant fills up on nothing, stops feeding early, and doesn't get enough. In an animal whose entire early survival depends on volume of intake, that matters enormously. And you can see how seriously other mammals take the same problem if you look at how they feed. Many young mammals nurse in postures that keep the head raised and the stomach low, which helps gas separate and rise. Feeding bouts are short and frequent, rather than long and heavy. The whole business is arranged around a limitation that we tend to think of as a minor domestic nuisance, and that is, for the animal, a genuine constraint on how much nutrition it can take on in a day. Anybody who has cared for a baby knows the standard human solution. You stop halfway through, lift them upright, pat their back, and wait for the burp, which works, but which requires an adult to be paying attention and to know to do it. Now hold that problem in your head and go back and look at what a hiccup actually does mechanically. What would you build if you had to solve it? Picture the chest and the stomach as two chambers, one above the other, and watch what happens to the pressure between them. A sudden, forceful contraction of the diaphragm creates an abrupt drop in pressure inside the chest, immediately above a stomach that is full. That pressure difference would tend to pull the contents of the upper stomach upward. And gas, being far lighter than liquid, sits at the top and moves first. And at the very same instant, the glottis slams shut, which means that whatever comes up cannot possibly go down into the lungs. Look at that arrangement again. A mechanism that draws gas upward out of a full stomach, with a hard mechanical guarantee that nothing gets inhaled while it happens. What does that describe? That's a burp, generated by the chest instead of the stomach, with a safety catch. It is, in its own small way, quite elegant, and crucially, it's one the infant can perform entirely on its own, without an adult, without being lifted, without anybody noticing. Which, for an animal that has to survive its own first weeks, is not a small advantage. This is the proposal put forward in 2012 by Daniel Howes and colleagues, and the evidence for it is circumstantial rather than conclusive, but it stacks up in a way that's hard to ignore once you start listing it. Infants hiccup far more than adults do. Not slightly more, enormously more. Newborns can spend a genuinely noticeable fraction of their waking and sleeping time doing it, to the point that new parents routinely worry about it and are routinely told, correctly, that it's normal. Premature infants hiccup more still. The earlier the birth, the higher the rate. Babies born before 37 weeks have been estimated to spend around 1% of their entire lives hiccuping, roughly 15 minutes of every single day, and the frequency declines steadily across childhood as feeding changes, until it settles into the occasional adult version that arrives a handful of times a year and means nothing. There's one more supporting observation, and it's a small one, but it points the same way. Hiccups in adults are far more likely after eating and drinking than at any other time, which is to say, they cluster around exactly the activity that filled a stomach, in exactly the animal that no longer needs the mechanism. The trigger conditions never changed. Only the usefulness did. That's exactly the profile you would expect from a reflex that has a real job in early life and no job afterward. It's abundant when it's needed, and it fades as the need disappears without ever quite vanishing, because there was never enough pressure to delete it. And it isn't only us. Puppies and kittens do it constantly, in exactly the same way, at exactly the same stage. If you've ever had a very young animal fall asleep on you and start twitching rhythmically, evenly, in a way that made you check they were all right, you have watched this happen in another species under this reading. The whole framing changes. Hiccups are not useless. They were useful. They were useful for you. Personally, at a stage of your life you cannot remember, and what happens to you now is a reflex that stayed installed after its purpose expired, which is a much smaller and more human story than the underwater one. And I find it more moving for exactly that reason. The gill theory asks you to imagine an ancestor you cannot picture in an ocean you have never seen. This one asks you to imagine yourself, a few weeks old, doing the only thing you had any real business doing, and making room for more. Now, I have to be straight with you about where all of this actually stands, because it would be easy to present one of those two theories as the answer and move on, and that would be false. Neither one is settled. Both are plausible. Both have supporters. Both have critics. And they are not even fully exclusive, which is the interesting part. It's entirely possible that an ancient circuit was inherited from aquatic ancestors, sat around largely unused for an extremely long time, and was then repurposed by early mammals for the feeding problem, which would give it a reason to be maintained and would let both stories be partly right at once. That's a common shape in evolution, incidentally. Old structures get recruited for new jobs constantly, and often beautifully. The bones in your middle ear that let you hear this were once part of a reptilian jaw, and there is a third group of researchers who find the entire framing unsatisfying. Their view is that we're looking for meaning where there isn't any, and that hiccups are simply a byproduct of the fact that the neural circuitry for breathing and the neural circuitry for swallowing are packed into the same small region of the brainstem and share components, two rhythms, tightly interleaved, occasionally colliding, not a leftover, not a purpose, just an unavoidable consequence of how the equipment is arranged. It's the least romantic of the three explanations, and it's the hardest to argue against, because it predicts exactly what we observe without requiring anything to have been inherited or preserved. If you build a swallowing circuit and a breathing circuit in the same square centimeter of tissue, and ask them to coordinate several thousand times a day for a lifetime, you should expect occasional interference. You would expect it in any system built that way, biological or otherwise. And under that reading, asking what a hiccup is for is a bit like asking what a squeak in a floorboard is for. It isn't for anything. It's what happens when two things that were built to fit are asked to fit forever. So which is it, water or milk or neither? Nobody has the answer. And there is no experiment anybody can obviously run that would settle it. You cannot go back and watch. You cannot breed the reflex out of a population and see what suffers. The evidence available is anatomical resemblance, developmental timing, comparison across species, and inference, all of which can support a good argument, and none of which can close one. And I want to say plainly how strange that is. This is not some obscure phenomenon at the frontier of physics. This is something that happens to every human being who has ever lived, that you have experienced hundreds of times, that occurs in every mammal, that has been observed and described and written about for thousands of years. And if you go looking for the explanation, you find a set of competing arguments, a lot of careful hedging, and a genuine, unresolved gap. I find that comforting, somehow. There's something quietly reassuring about the fact that a thing this common, this ordinary, this thoroughly ours, is still an open question. It suggests the world hasn't been entirely used up. But there is one more piece of evidence, and it's the strangest one in the whole story. And I've been deliberately saving it for now. If you've drifted back in just now, all you need to know is that we've been asking where this reflex came from, and that nobody is certain. What follows is the strangest piece of evidence in the whole story. You hiccuped before you had air. Fetal hiccups are real, common, and thoroughly documented. They can be seen on ultrasound remarkably early, from around the 8th or 9th week of gestation. That's before most people even know a pregnancy exists. That's when the entire developing human is somewhere in the region of the size of a raspberry. And they are among the very first coordinated, genuinely extraordinary movements that a developing human being makes. Not one of many. Among the first. Before there is anything you would call a face. Before the fingers have separated properly. Before the ears have finished migrating up the side of the head to where they will eventually sit. At a stage when almost nothing about the body is finished. This particular circuit is already assembled, already connected, and already firing on a rhythm. Now here's the detail that does the real work, and it's the one that stopped me when I first came across it. Hiccuping appears before breathing movements do. The fetus will eventually start making practice breathing motions, drawing amniotic fluid in and out, rehearsing the pattern it will need on the day it's born. But that comes later. The hiccup arrives first. It shows up before the thing it's supposedly a corruption of. Anyone who has been pregnant or has been close to someone who was usually knows this from the inside, even without knowing what it's called. There's a very particular sensation that people describe, not a kick, which is irregular and sharp and could be anywhere. Something rhythmic, small, evenly spaced taps from within, arriving with metronome regularity, going on for a few minutes and then stopping, sometimes several times a day. It's often described as one of the strangest sensations of a pregnancy, precisely because it's so mechanical. Movement you can interpret. A limb pushing out, a shift of position, those feel like a person doing something. This doesn't feel like anybody doing anything. It feels like a machine running on a timer, which, in the most literal sense, is exactly what it is. People say the baby has the hiccups, and they're right. That's precisely what it is. Same mechanism, same circuit, same nerves, months before birth. So what is it practicing for? And with what? And there is no air in there. That's the thing to hold on to. The lungs are full of fluid. There's no respiratory function to serve, no oxygen to gain, no gas to expel, no stomach full of swallowed milk. Because there's no milk and no swallowing of the kind we've been describing. Every functional explanation we've discussed tonight is unavailable. And it isn't a rare event either. In the third trimester, fetal hiccup episodes have been recorded happening several times a day, lasting anywhere from a few minutes to considerably longer, using energy that a developing organism can hardly be said to have to spare. Whatever this is, the body is investing in it at a stage when almost nothing is wasted. So, what on earth is it doing? What could it possibly be for in a body that has nothing to breathe, nothing to swallow, and nothing to expel? Think about the problem from the body's side. How do you test equipment you have never used for a job that hasn't started yet? The most widely discussed answer is that it's practice, or, more precisely, calibration. Think about the problem the developing nervous system faces. It has to end up in control of a muscle that will, from the first second after birth, be responsible for keeping the whole organism alive. There will be no opportunity to test it later. The first breath has to work, so it wires the circuit early, and then it tests it. It sends a signal down the cable and confirms that the cable exists, that the muscle is on the other end, that the contraction happens, and that the response comes back, and there is evidence pointing that way. In 2019, a team at University College London, led by a researcher named Kimberly Whitehead, with Lorenzo Fabrizi as the senior author, attached electrodes to the scalps of 13 newborn babies, ranging from 30 to 42 weeks, and simply watched what happened in the brain each time one of them hiccuped. What they found was that every hiccup produced a large, distinct wave of activity in the developing cortex, which suggests the brain isn't merely producing the contraction. It's registering it, noticing it, using the feedback from each one to help build a map of where the body is, what it just did, and which part of the brain corresponds to which part of the self. And there's a broader version of this happening throughout development. The fetus kicks and stretches and grasps and makes facial expressions, all long before any of those actions have an audience or a purpose. A great deal of what a developing body does is rehearsal for a world it has never encountered, run in advance in the dark on the basis of instructions inherited from bodies that got there first. If that's right, then a hiccup in the womb is a ping. Picture a single pulse traveling down a wire in the dark, a test signal sent down a line to confirm the line is there and to find out what's at the other end of it. And the London team drew the obvious conclusion out loud. Whitehead's own suggestion, after looking at those 13 infants, was that hiccups in adults, which seem to be nothing but a nuisance, may be exactly that. A leftover from infancy, from a period when the thing had a real job to do, which means the very first thing your diaphragm ever did, before your first breath, before your first cry, before your first anything at all, months before you had any use for air, was hiccup. Whatever else that is, it isn't a malfunction. It was there at the start, its original equipment. There's a last thought about the fetal version that I want to leave with you before we move on, because it reframes something we said much earlier. We opened tonight by observing that this reflex appears to have no function, and that's still true of the version you experience as an adult. But if the calibration idea holds, then it isn't quite right to say the reflex is purposeless. It's that the purpose ran out. It did its work early, thoroughly, before you existed as anyone who could remember it, and then it stayed on, the way a program left running in the background stays on, consuming almost nothing, occasionally announcing itself, not useless, finished, and there's something quietly companionable in that, if you let it sit. Everybody listening to this did the same thing, in the same order, in the dark, before they were anybody. The same circuit, the same rhythm, the same small unnecessary pulse, running in every one of us at the same stage, testing a line that had only just been laid down. Whatever else you are, you were that first. All of you were. So that's the harmless version, the universal version, the one that everybody gets, that arrives after a fizzy drink or a rushed meal that is faintly embarrassing and completely trivial and gone in 4 minutes. But there is another version of this. A version where the circuit switches on and does not switch off. And to understand what that actually costs a person, we have to go to a farm in Iowa. In the summer of 1922, Charles Osborne was 28 years old, and he was preparing to slaughter a hog by his own account. Given many times over the following decades, he was hanging a 350-pound hog for butchering. He picked it up, and he fell. The date was the 13th of June, 1922. It's worth pausing on how ordinary that moment was. There was no dramatic injury, no blood, no broken bone, nothing that would send a person to a doctor in 1922 rural Iowa or anywhere else. A man carrying something heavy loses his footing and goes down, which happens on farms constantly, every week, everywhere. He got up. He dusted himself off. He didn't think much of it. He felt fine. And then he started hiccuping. He would not stop for 68 years. Not 68 days. Not 68 weeks. Years. I want to be very clear that this is not a legend, not a tall tale, and not a misprint. Guinness World Records lists it, and has done for decades, as the longest attack of hiccups ever recorded. Nobody has come close. The nearest documented cases are measured in years, not decades. Osborne's case was investigated repeatedly across the decades by physicians who examined him in person. It was documented at the time and afterward. It holds the record, and nobody has ever come close to it. From 1922 until 1990, essentially without interruption, his diaphragm fired on a schedule that nothing anyone tried could persuade it to abandon. In the early years, the rate ran at around 40 a minute. Later in his life, it slowed to roughly 20. If you do the arithmetic, and people have, it lands somewhere in the region of 400 million individual hiccups. 400 million. It's not a number that means very much said out loud. Almost no large number does. Try it this way instead. Every second and a half, awake or asleep, working or resting for longer than most people are alive. But the arithmetic isn't the part of this story that matters. What does? What matters is how he lived, and this is the part I keep returning to. He married twice. He had 8 children. He farmed, he worked. He was not, by any account from anyone who knew him, a man whose life was consumed by it, although he obviously could never ignore it either. He adapted. He learned to breathe in the gaps between the contractions in a particular way that let him speak with only a slight, regular interruption. Neighbors who knew him as children remembered it as simply how he talked, a small flex of the chest 3 or 4 times a minute, and nothing more. And he was, for a while, genuinely famous for it. He appeared on Ripley's Believe It or Not in the 1930s. He was on television again in 1980, and he sat down with Johnny Carson in 1983. He ended up as an answer in Trivial Pursuit. Thousands of strangers wrote to him over the years with suggestions. People who spoke with him said you got used to it within a few minutes. He had to change how he ate. He took his food soft and finely ground because swallowing and airway closure are delicately coordinated at the best of times, and his coordination was being interrupted constantly. So he adapted around it, the way people adapt around most things, by finding the version that worked and then not thinking about it much. And he slept. People always ask about that. And the answer is that he slept for 68 years through all of it. The body accommodates a great deal, given time. It stops registering what doesn't change. It cost him things over that many years. Of course it did. But he kept working, and he kept farming, and he kept going. And the doctors tried. Over the decades, a long line of them tried. He was examined at the Mayo Clinic. Every new drug that came along was tried on him as it became available. Various procedures were attempted. At one point, he was offered surgery. Cutting the phrenic nerve would have stopped it definitively, because you cannot fire a muscle whose cable has been severed. It would also have permanently paralyzed half of his diaphragm, with everything that means for breathing. For the rest of a life spent doing physical work on a farm, he said no. And he said it more than once over the years, as the offer came round again with different surgeons attached to it. Sit with that choice for a second, because it isn't a small one. He was being offered an end to something that had already lasted decades, at the price of permanently disabling part of the machinery that kept him alive. And he decided he would rather keep hiccuping. He said it himself in an interview, in words far plainer than any doctor managed. He picked up the hog. He fell down. He felt nothing. And a doctor told him later that he had burst a blood vessel in his brain roughly the size of a pin. A pin, 68 years. The physician who treated him later in life, a man named Terence Anthony, put it in essentially the same terms. The most likely explanation for his case, arrived at afterward, is that the fall destroyed a very small area of tissue in his brainstem. Something on the order of the size of a pinhead in the region that inhibits the hiccup reflex, the brake, in other words. And remember what we established earlier. The pattern generator doesn't need a reason to run. It runs because that's what pattern generators do. What keeps it quiet is inhibition, a constant background signal telling it not to. Remove the brake, and the circuit simply does what it has always been capable of doing, forever, with no more reason than a metronome has. And nothing worked. Not for long, and mostly not at all. Some things gave him a few hours, some gave him nothing. Over 6 decades. Essentially, the entire available medical toolkit of the 20th century was pointed at one man's diaphragm, and it simply kept going. Then, in 1990, without any treatment, without any warning, and for no reason that anybody has ever been able to identify, it stopped. He was 96. He lived roughly another year, hiccup-free, and died in May of 1991 at 97. I don't want to make that story neater than it was, because it wasn't neat for him, and there's a temptation with cases like this to turn a person into a curiosity. He wasn't a curiosity. He was a farmer who fell over while lifting a pig, and then lived a whole life underneath something he never asked for. But there's a thing in it I keep coming back to. 68 years of an involuntary sound every second and a half. And he farmed, and he married, and he raised 8 children. And by every account of the people who actually knew him, he was decent company. There's one more thing about his case that connects back to everything we've been building tonight, and I'd like to leave it here as we move on. Everything that happened to Charles Osborne happened because of the anatomy we spent the first part of this describing. A pattern generator in the brainstem that runs on its own and needs to be held quiet. A small region of inhibition holding it. A long nerve running down to a muscle that does not get a vote. All of it perfectly ordinary equipment, present in every person listening, doing exactly what it is built to do. Nothing about him was unusual. The only unusual thing was that one very small part of a very ordinary system stopped saying no. Bodies do extraordinary things to us, and mostly, remarkably, we just carry on. His case sits at the far end of a spectrum, and doctors have drawn a line across that spectrum at a very specific place, and that line is probably the single most useful thing in this entire video. It separates a nuisance from a message. There are 3 recognized categories. Acute hiccups last less than 48 hours. This is what essentially everyone means when they say the word. They arrive, they irritate you for a few minutes or a few hours, and they leave. They almost never mean anything at all. Pellucid hiccups last longer than 48 hours, but less than a month, and intractable hiccups last longer than a month. That first threshold, 2 days, is the one worth remembering, because it's the point at which the meaning of the symptom changes completely. And 2 days is longer than it sounds in this context. Almost nobody reaches it. A typical episode is somewhere between a few minutes and half an hour. An unusually stubborn one might run for a few hours and feel like an eternity. 48 continuous hours is already extraordinarily far outside the normal range. Underneath 48 hours, a hiccup is a nerve being nudged, a stomach that got too full, a drink that was too cold, a rush of swallowed air, a meal eaten too quickly. Something touched a long cable, and the cable complained, and the complaint will pass. Beyond 48 hours, it stops being a nuisance and starts being a sign, because now something is pressing on, or inflaming, or interfering with a reflex arc, and we have already spent a long time tonight establishing exactly how much territory that arc covers. And I want to be careful about how I say this next part, because there's a particular way that medical information lands at 1 in the morning, and it isn't always the way it was intended. So let me set the tone before we start. Almost everything in the next few minutes is rare. The overwhelming majority of hiccups anybody has ever had were caused by eating too fast. What follows is not a list of things to worry about. It's a demonstration of something we've already established, which is that a very long nerve passes through a very large amount of the body, and that anything sitting on it can shout. Now, before we go through the causes, there's a pattern in the data that nobody has explained. And I think it's worth naming, because it's a genuine loose end, pieced and intractable hiccups are strikingly more common in men. It has been noticed for a very long time too. In 1967, a neurologist named C.M. Fisher published a paper on protracted hiccups and gave it a title that says everything. He called it a male malady. The imbalance in the published case literature is substantial. It is not subtle, and it is not a matter of a few percentage points. And it does not appear in ordinary short-lived hiccups at all, which everybody gets, evenly, regardless of anything. Some of that is probably explained by differences in the rates of the underlying conditions that cause the long version. Some of it may be reporting, but it doesn't fully account for the size of the gap, and nobody has produced a satisfying answer. So that's another quiet, open question, sitting in the middle of a subject that keeps producing them. Now, what causes the long ones? And why is it so hard to say? The list is long, but it organizes beautifully if you keep the map from earlier in your head, because it isn't really a list of diseases. It's a journey down a nerve, scarred at the bottom, in the abdomen. By far the most common thing found down there is simple reflux. Acid rising into the esophagus, repeatedly, irritating vagal territory, day after day. That's it. That's the usual answer. It's a thoroughly ordinary one, and it's treatable. A stomach that's distended or inflamed for any of the everyday reasons does much the same thing. Come up into the chest. And it's the same principle with different neighbors. Anything inflamed near the base of the lungs or near the membrane around the heart, is sitting more or less on top of the phrenic nerve as it passes. The nerve doesn't distinguish between causes. It just reports pressure. Come up into the neck, and again, anything that occupies space in a region that hasn't got much to spare will do it. And then there's the brainstem itself, where the circuit lives. Anything that interferes with the small amount of inhibition holding that circuit quiet will let it run, which is very likely what happened to Charles Osborne when he fell. There are also causes that don't press on anything at all, and instead change the chemistry the whole system is running in. And there are medications which matter more than people expect. Several very common drug families have this as a listed side effect, including some given routinely alongside serious treatment. And it's one of the first things a doctor will check. And how rare is the long version actually? Rare enough that most doctors will see very few in a career. The figure usually quoted for genuinely intractable cases is somewhere around 1 in 100,000 people, which means that of everybody listening to this tonight, almost none of you will ever meet it. Now, I am deliberately not reading you a list of diagnoses here. And I'd like to say why. Because a list of names at this hour isn't information. It's just a set of things to lie in the dark matching yourself against. And it wouldn't tell you anything that the principle doesn't already tell you. So what should you actually take away from all of that? And the principle is simple. Anything. Anywhere along a very long nerve that leans on it hard enough for long enough. That's the whole model. It doesn't much matter what the thing is called. What matters is that somebody knows where to look, and they do. That's a solved problem, and it has been for a long time, and it isn't yours to solve tonight. And that's the part of this subject that quietly changed how I think about it. Because for somebody who is already unwell, already tired, already struggling to rest, an unrelenting hiccup stops being a comic inconvenience and becomes the thing standing between them and sleep. Which is why there's a real body of clinical work devoted to managing it properly in exactly those situations. Somebody thought it was worth taking seriously at a time when nobody would have blamed them for treating it as trivial. I'm glad they did, and that's part of why gabapentin has become as widely used as it has. Because a great deal of the practical experience with treating hiccups seriously has come out of palliative care, where the whole priority is comfort, and where somebody being unable to rest is not a minor complaint. A lot of what is known about managing this well was learned by people looking after the very ill. It's a small kindness buried in a corner of medicine that nobody was ever going to win a prize for. But it's there. Now, we've been carrying something since much earlier tonight, and this is where it comes due. Do you remember the branch of the vagus nerve that supplies the ear canal? The one that explains why some people cough when a doctor examines their ear. There are documented cases, more than one, of intractable hiccups that lasted for weeks, that resisted investigation, that survived a full workup looking for tumors and strokes and reflux and everything else. and that were cured completely by removing a single hair from the patient's ear canal, a hair, resting against the eardrum. That's the whole diagnosis, and it is one of the most delightful things in the literature. Tugging very slightly on a sensory branch of the vagus nerve thousands of times a day, sending a complaint upward into the brainstem that the brainstem could only interpret one way. I love that case, and I love it for a reason beyond the obvious, because it tells you exactly what kind of symptom this is. A hiccup that won't stop is reporting a fault along an extremely long cable without telling you where along the cable the fault is. The signal is loud and the location is completely silent, and there's a nice consequence buried in that. Because if the fault can be anywhere along the cable, then the cure can be anywhere along the cable too. The hair case is not a fluke of luck. It's the exact prediction of the model. Fix the irritation wherever it happens to be sitting, and the signal stops, and the loop stops with it, which is why the sensible response to a persistent case is a search that looks to the patient faintly absurd. Someone will listen to your chest and press on your abdomen and take blood and quite possibly scan your head. And at some point, they will pick up an otoscope and look in your ear. And that isn't a doctor running out of ideas. That's a doctor who understands the map. There's a case that shows the whole model working exactly as it should. And I want to tell you that one before we go on, because it's the hopeful version. In 2006, a musician in Lincolnshire, in England, named Christopher Sands, started hiccuping. He was a singer. It went on for around 3 years, and it took his career from him because you cannot perform when your chest interrupts you every few seconds. Doctors in England looked and found nothing. Eventually, his case got some attention, and specialists in the United States took another look, and they found something small pressing on his brainstem, in exactly the region we've been describing all night. They removed it, the hiccups stopped. That's the model working cleanly and beautifully. A signal arriving from somewhere along a long cable, somebody finding the somewhere and the signal ending. 3 years and then quiet. Which raises the obvious question. If you can find the cause, can you actually treat it? Because everything we've said so far assumes that finding the problem is the hard part, and that once you've found it, the rest follows. That's how most of medicine works. Identify the cause, remove the cause, symptom resolves. But this particular symptom has a complicated relationship with treatment. And to understand why, it helps to look at a case where nobody found a cause at all. And here the story takes a turn that I genuinely did not expect when I started reading about this. In 2007, a 15-year-old in Florida named Jennifer Mee started hiccuping and could not stop for around 5 weeks. The rate was roughly 50 a minute. That's not far off 1 a second. Awake, sleep, in class, at meals, mid-sentence, for over a month. Her case became a small international story, partly because of the sheer strangeness of the duration, and partly because she was young and articulate and appeared on television, describing what it was actually like. She was tested extensively, Nobody ever found a cause. And then, like Osborne's, it stopped on its own, without anybody being able to say why. What stayed with me about her case wasn't the medical mystery. It was watching what happened around her. So why did it become a story at all? Why not simply a medical curiosity? Because here's the thing about this particular symptom. Our culture has collectively decided that it's funny. Think about how differently we treat the others. Picture someone in a quiet room coughing, and then picture the same room, the same person hiccuping. Which one gets a smile? Coughing is concerning. Vomiting is unpleasant and slightly alarming. Sneezing is neutral, a fact of life, occasionally a joke about allergies. Bleeding is serious, but hiccuping is comic, universally. Across cultures, across languages, across centuries. It's in cartoons, it's in slapstick, where it's usually shorthand for having had too much to drink. It's in the way a room reacts when somebody does it during a moment of silence. And that's harmless, mostly. It's a very small thing to find amusing, and it hurts nobody. And I'm not going to pretend to be offended by cartoons, but it means that when it stops being harmless, the person experiencing it has to fight through a layer of amusement before anybody takes them seriously. Every interview from that period carried the same awkward double tone. Real sympathy underneath, and a persistent, almost helpless inability to stop treating the whole thing as a novelty item. She became, for a period, a curiosity with a nickname, and that framing followed her long afterward in ways that had nothing to do with medicine at all. I think there's something worth noticing in why we find it funny at all, actually. Most comedy about the body is about dignity failing, and this is one of the purest examples available because it interrupts speech, which is the thing we use to present ourselves. You can be halfway through saying something serious, or important, or heartfelt, and your own chest will cut you off at regular intervals in front of everybody. It's funny for the same reason it's frustrating. You are being edited by yourself, and you did not approve the changes. There's a small lesson in that, about what it's like to have a symptom that other people find entertaining. But her case also points at something structural, which is that treatment for this condition is genuinely poor. And the reason is more interesting than simple neglect. It's rare. Truly persistent cases are uncommon. So at any given moment, there are not many patients available. It isn't fatal. However miserable it is, it does not kill people directly, which means it does not attract research funding in the way that conditions which do will always attract it. And why is the evidence so weak? It resolves spontaneously at unpredictable times, which is the killer. Think about what that does to evidence. Imagine trying to prove anything at all under those conditions. You give someone a treatment. 2 days later, the hiccups stop. Did your treatment work? Or was that the day it was going to stop anyway? With a condition that ends on its own schedule, after a duration that ranges from hours to decades, you can almost never tell the difference in a single patient. And you cannot easily run a proper randomized trial on a condition that affects a scattered handful of people in different hospitals, in different countries, presenting with different underlying causes. There's one more difficulty on top of all of that, which is that the causes are so varied that the patients aren't really comparable. A person whose hiccups come from reflux, a person whose hiccups come from a brainstem stroke, and a person whose hiccups came on during chemotherapy do not have the same condition in any useful sense. They share a symptom. Pooling them into one trial produces a result that applies to nobody. So the evidence base is thin, and a great deal of what is known comes from case reports, which is to say, individual doctors writing up individual patients and saying, in effect, this worked for this person. Make of it what you will. That is the least powerful form of medical evidence there is. It is one step above an anecdote. And in this field, it is most of what exists. So the honest summary is that the treatment of intractable hiccups is one of the less impressive corners of modern medicine. Not through any failure of effort or intelligence, but because the condition is structurally almost impossible to study properly. And what doctors reach for, as a result, is a short list, with one entry on it that is, I promise you, entirely real, and quite unlike anything else in medicine. If you've just come back to this, we've reached the part where doctors actually try to stop it. So what actually works? Let's start with the drugs. Chlorpromazine is the traditional one. It's an old antipsychotic, and it remains the only drug specifically approved for hiccups in the United States. An approval that dates from an era with considerably looser standards of evidence than we'd apply today. And it does work for many people. It also causes drowsiness and drops in blood pressure, and with prolonged use, movement disorders that can be permanent. So it works in roughly the way a hammer works. Effective, blunt, and not something you reach for casually. Baclofen is a muscle relaxant that acts on the spinal cord and brainstem. It has arguably the best evidence behind it of anything on this list, including at least one small randomized placebo-controlled trial, which in a field this thin is genuinely notable. When almost all your evidence is case reports, a single proper trial stands out considerably. Gabapentin has become widely used. It's generally well tolerated. It has a reasonable record across published case series, and it's frequently the first thing tried now, particularly in palliative care, where the priority is comfort and where the side effect profile of chlorpromazine is unattractive. Metoclopramide takes a different approach entirely. Rather than acting on the nervous system, it helps the stomach empty faster, which addresses the trigger rather than the reflex, and works only for the substantial group of people whose hiccups are coming from below. Beyond the drugs, there are procedures, nerve blocks, where local anesthetic is injected near the phrenic nerve, can interrupt the circuit temporarily. They are sometimes used diagnostically as much as therapeutically to find out whether that particular route is the culprit before anyone considers anything permanent. Phrenic nerve division is the operation Charles Osborne turned down, and it's rarely done now. Cutting the nerve stops the hiccup definitively and permanently paralyzes half of the diaphragm along with it. Losing half your breathing muscle for the rest of your life in order to stop a symptom is a serious trade, and modern practice is reluctant to make it. There's also a technique involving passing a thin, flexible catheter through the nose to the back of the throat and stimulating the pharynx directly. It sounds crude because it is. It's unpleasant. And it works for a meaningful number of people, which is why it survives in the literature. It's essentially a mechanical way of shocking a nerve into resetting. And there are the incidental discoveries, which are my favorite kind. There are case reports of people who had vagus nerve stimulators implanted for entirely unrelated reasons, usually epilepsy, and whose long-standing, intractable hiccups simply stopped as a side effect. Nobody was trying to treat the hiccups. The device was doing something else entirely. But it happened to be sitting on the vagus nerve, doing to it deliberately what a full stomach or a cold drink does to it accidentally. That's evidence for the whole theory arriving sideways, from a direction nobody was looking in, which is generally the most convincing kind. It's worth saying, before we get there, that most persistent cases are ultimately managed by finding the cause rather than by attacking the reflex. Treat the reflux, drain the abscess, change the medication, fix what is pressing on the nerve. That's the real answer, when there is one, and it works far better than anything aimed at the circuit itself. Everything else on the list is what you do when that hasn't worked, or when there's nothing to find. Which brings us, finally, to the single most memorable entry in the entire medical literature on this subject. In August of 1988, an emergency physician in Tennessee named Francis Fesmeyer published a case report in the Annals of Emergency Medicine describing the successful termination of intractable hiccups by digital rectal massage. And 2 years later, a team at a hospital in Haifa, in Israel, read his paper, tried the technique on a patient of their own, and it worked. So Majed Ode, Harry Bassan, and Ari Olivan published a second case report with, as far as anyone can tell, exactly the same title. I promise you that is real. And I promise there is a perfectly sound logic behind it. Why on earth would that work? The rationale runs like this, and it is remarkably clean. The vagus nerve, as we established a long time ago tonight, extends down into the abdomen and supplies large portions of the digestive tract, including the lower end of it. Vigorous stimulation there sends a strong sensory signal up the very same nerve that is involved in the reflex loop. And that signal, arriving loudly, interrupts the loop. It is exactly the same principle as the nose catheter. It is exactly the same principle as pulling hard on someone's tongue, which is a documented technique. It is the same principle as pressing on the closed eyes, which is another. All of them are vagal maneuvers, and all of them work by overwhelming the nerve with input from somewhere in its enormous territory. This one simply happens to be the most undignified available version. All four of them were jointly awarded the Ig Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2006. Fesmeyer went to Harvard to collect it in person and the ceremony being what it is, his work was demonstrated on stage with the assistance of an actual Nobel laureate in chemistry. The Ig Nobels are given each year for research that first makes people laugh and then makes them think. And that is exactly the correct response here, because the finding is simultaneously ridiculous and perfectly sound. If your theory says that hiccups are a vagal reflex loop, then interrupting that loop by flooding the vagus with a signal from anywhere along its territory is precisely, exactly what your theory predicts. And I'd point out that it was published twice, independently, by different people who did not know about each other's work, which is, in its own peculiar way, replication. Two separate clinicians, faced with a patient nobody could help, reasoned their way down the same anatomical map and arrived at the same unlikely destination. Fesmire himself, who died in 2014, understood the joke perfectly well and enjoyed it enormously. He later told an interviewer that he had identified an alternative vagal maneuver that patients would find considerably more agreeable, and I'll leave you to work out what he meant. Sometimes the funniest result in a field is the one that confirms the mechanism most cleanly. And that observation isn't a throwaway. Because if you take every single cure ever invented for this, every drug, every procedure, and every strange thing your grandmother ever told you to do with a glass of water, and you sort them by what they physically do, they collapse into exactly two piles. Everybody has a cure. That's the first thing to say. Ask any 5 people in a room and watch what happens. It is one of the very few areas of medicine where every single person you meet considers themselves an authority, and where they are, to a surprising degree, entitled to. Everybody's cure is the one that definitely works, and everybody's is different. And everybody is slightly offended when you suggest theirs might not be doing what they think it is. And here's what's genuinely delightful. Most of them are, in a rough and accidental way, correct. Not because anybody worked out the physiology. Nobody in the year 1650 had heard of a vagus nerve. Nobody in any village anywhere was reasoning about carbon dioxide partial pressures. These remedies were arrived at the way almost everything used to be arrived at, which is trial and error and several thousand years of people trying whatever was within reach and remembering what seemed to help. But if you lay all of them out and ask what each one physically does to the body, they sort themselves into 2 categories. 2 levers. So what are they? Lever 1. Raise your carbon dioxide. Remember, a long time ago tonight, I mentioned that hiccup frequency tends to fall as the carbon dioxide in your blood rises, and asked you to file it away. This is where it comes back. Anything that makes you hold your breath or breathe less or rebreathe air you've already used is pushing on this lever. Lever 2. Overwhelm the vagus nerve. Set a loud, unusual, sustained sensory signal down vagal territory. The throat, the back of the mouth, the pharynx, the eardrum, the eyes, the gut. Anywhere the nerve reaches, which is nearly everywhere. Jam the frequency and the reflex loop cannot complete. That's it. Those are the 2 moves. Everything else is packaging. And almost every folk cure in existence is pulling on one or the other. And the very best ones pull both at once. And there's a third category, which I should mention only so that we can set it aside, which is the remedies that do nothing at all and work anyway. A very large number of ordinary hiccup episodes last a few minutes and then stop, which means that anything you do in those few minutes will appear to have worked roughly half the time, no matter what it is. That's how a great deal of folklore survives. Not because it does nothing, but because the thing it was aimed at was going to end anyway. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go. Some of these are real. Some of these are timing. And I want to show you how old this is, because there's a passage that I find genuinely delightful, and it's about 2,400 years old. In Plato's Symposium, a group of Athenians are taking turns making speeches about love. And when it comes to the playwright Aristophanes' turn, he cannot speak because he has the hiccups. Too much dinner, the text suggests. So he turns to the man on the next couch, who happens to be a physician named Eryximachus, and asks him either to cure the hiccups or to take his turn. And Eryximachus gives him a prescription. 3 steps in order. First, hold your breath for as long as you possibly can. If that doesn't work, gargle with water. And if it is really stubborn, tickle your nose with something until you sneeze. Once or twice should do it. Now look at what that is. Hold your breath. That's lever 1, raising carbon dioxide. State it first because it's the most reliable. Gargle. That's lever 2, direct pharyngeal stimulation of the vagus. And sneeze, which is the most violent respiratory disruption a person can generate on demand, and which resets the whole rhythm by force. 2,500 years ago, a fictional Athenian doctor at a dinner party laid out a treatment algorithm that is, in its mechanism, correct. He had no idea why. He could not have had. But he had the order right, and he had the escalation right. And every step of it maps onto something we can now explain. And the story ends the way these things ought to. Aristophanes goes through all 3 in sequence, while Eryximachus makes his speech. And by the end of it, he reports that the hiccups have stopped. It was the sneeze that did it. That is the oldest recorded hiccup cure that actually works. And it survives because a philosopher thought it was funny enough to write down. Let's go through them, holding your breath. This is pure lever 1, applied as directly as it can be applied. It's the most reliable, simple technique there is, and it's the ancestor of half of the others on this list. 30 seconds or so, repeated a couple of times, breathing into a paper bag. Also lever 1, arriving by a different route. You rebreathe your own exhaled carbon dioxide. So the level in your blood climbs without you having to consciously hold anything at all. It works. It comes with a sensible caution that you should stop if you feel lightheaded, and it isn't for anybody with a question mark over their heart or lungs. Drinking a full glass of water without stopping. This one is doing several things simultaneously, which is precisely why it's the most widely believed in cure on earth. Repeated rapid swallowing is a strong, rhythmic vagal stimulus, which is lever 2. and it forces you to suspend breathing for the duration, which is lever 1. 2 levers, 1 glass, no instructions required. That's why it survived everywhere. It's the only remedy on this list that is both universally available and mechanically sound, and it needed no explanation to spread. You could teach it to somebody without sharing a language, drinking from the far side of the glass. The one that sounds like pure superstition, and the one that everybody's aunt swears by. It isn't superstition. Picture somebody doing it. Look at what it actually forces you to do. You have to bend forward at the waist, which compresses the abdomen and changes the position of the diaphragm. You have to hold your breath because of the angle, and you have to swallow awkwardly in an unfamiliar posture with more effort than usual. Notice what's actually happening. The awkwardness is the active ingredient. It's a genuine and rather elegant physiological maneuver, wearing an extremely silly costume. A spoonful of dry granulated sugar, swallowed without water. This is straightforward lever 2. The coarse granules provide strong mechanical stimulation to the back of the pharynx, right where the sensory branches of the vagus are waiting. There's a small clinical literature behind it. It's completely harmless, and it has the significant advantage that children will actually cooperate with it, which cannot be said of most of this list. A wedge of lemon, a spoonful of vinegar. Same territory, same nerve, using sourness and shock instead of texture, pulling firmly on your own tongue. This is genuinely in the medical literature, not a schoolyard trick. Firm traction on the tongue stimulates the pharynx directly, undignified and effective, pressing gently on your closed eyelids. This is a real vagal reflex, and doctors have historically used the same maneuver to slow a racing heart, which tells you how strong the connection is. I mention it for completeness, and I'd rather you didn't experiment with it, because eyes are not a good place to apply pressure casually, being frightened. The classic, and also the most likely to fail, for an entirely practical reason. A genuine startle does change your breathing abruptly, and does flood the system with a strong signal, and it can knock the rhythm off its loop. The problem is that you cannot reliably surprise a person who has just asked you to surprise them. The mechanism is sound. The delivery is impossible. Gargling with ice water, swallowing crushed ice, biting into a lemon soaked in bitters, which is a real bartender's remedy. All lever 2. All pharyngeal, all the same idea with increasing amounts of theater, hugging your knees to your chest or leaning forward over a table. Purely mechanical. Compresses the abdomen and changes the pressures the diaphragm is working against. And then there is the modern entry, the only one on this entire list that was actually designed. In 2021, a paper appeared in JAMA Network Open describing a small device developed by Ali Saifi, who runs the Neurological Intensive Care Unit at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, along with colleagues in the United States, Argentina, and Switzerland. Physically, it is a rigid drinking straw with a valve at the bottom, so that drawing water through it requires substantially more suction than an ordinary straw does. You put it in a glass of water. You drink hard. And what that forces is a genuinely coordinated sequence. You have to contract the diaphragm strongly to generate the suction. Then you have to close the glottis to swallow. Then you repeat. It's called forced inspiratory suction and swallow. And it deliberately, mechanically drives both nerve pathways involved in the reflex in sequence at high intensity every time. Now, the study behind it was a survey rather than a randomized trial. And that's a real limitation which I'd rather state plainly than skip past. 674 people volunteered to receive the device. Of the ones who filled in the questionnaire afterward, around 90% said it worked for them. Nobody reported any harm from it. That's encouraging. It is not proof. A survey of people who signed up for a hiccup device and then reported on their own experience is a long way from a controlled trial, and Safi's team said so themselves. So why does a straw work when a drug often doesn't? And what I find interesting about it isn't the product. It's what it demonstrates. Picture somebody actually doing this. Somebody took the pile of folk remedies, worked out which physiological lever each one was accidentally pulling, and then built a small object that pulls both of them on purpose, hard, reliably, every time. That's the entire story of medicine in miniature. Centuries of people doing something that works for reasons nobody understands. Then, eventually, somebody understands it, and then somebody builds a better version. It's also quietly a reminder that the folk remedies were never really wrong. They were unexplained, which is a completely different thing. People were performing sound physiological interventions for hundreds of years, while attributing them to entirely imaginary mechanisms. And the interventions worked anyway, because the body does not care what you believe about it. And note the humility in the result. After all of that, the engineered solution is still essentially a straw. It isn't a drug. It isn't surgery. Sometimes the right answer to a very old problem turns out to be a slightly cleverer version of the very old answer. So that's the mechanism, and the history, and the medicine, and the cures, which leaves the question we started with, and a handful of facts that don't fit anywhere except right here, at the end, because they're the ones I like most. Every mammal hiccups: cats, dogs, rats, horses, rabbits. It's been observed across the whole group. And puppies and kittens do it constantly, at exactly the stage of life when human infants do, which is one more quiet vote for the feeding explanation. Birds and reptiles essentially don't. They don't have a mammalian diaphragm, and they don't produce the reflex, which places the modern version of this squarely somewhere on the mammal branch, whatever ancient circuitry it may have been built on top of. And how many will you have? Nobody has measured it properly, which is itself a small scandal. But if you assume a handful of episodes a year, at a few dozen hiccups each, an ordinary lifetime comes out somewhere in the low tens of thousands. Charles Osborne, by contrast, managed an estimated 430 million. You cannot fake one. Not properly. You can imitate the sound, and people do, and it's usually convincing enough for comedy. but you cannot voluntarily produce the actual event, which requires a genuine inspiratory contraction terminated by a glottal closure 35 thousandths of a second later. That timing is below the resolution of conscious control. You physically cannot get there from intention. It's one of a very small set of things your body can do that you cannot. Your heart can change its rate. Your pupils can change their size. Your stomach can decide it's had enough, and your diaphragm can do this. None of those are available to you on request, and there's something in that worth noticing. We tend to think of the body as ours in the way a house is ours, but a considerable amount of it is simply running on its own schedule, with no interface exposed to you at all. You're a tenant in some of these rooms. Your hiccups have a signature, because the interval within an episode is so regular, and because the interval differs enough between individuals, people who know each other well can often identify who is hiccuping in the next room. Consider that for a second. It's a remarkably strange sort of fingerprint to be carrying around, and one that almost nobody knows they have. Alcohol is almost purpose-built as a trigger, and it's worth appreciating how comprehensively. It relaxes the valve at the top of the stomach, which permits reflux. It distends the stomach if it's carbonated. It usually arrives cold. It's frequently consumed quickly, and it tends to be drunk in social situations involving talking, laughing, and eating at speed. That's 5 triggers at once, which is why it has such an unshakable reputation. And the 48-hour line, which I'll say once more, calmly, to be held lightly rather than anxiously. Under 2 days, it's a nerve being nudged, and it means nothing. Over 2 days, it's worth mentioning to somebody. That's the whole rule. So what have we actually got after all of that? What is this thing? A reflex with no confirmed purpose, driven by 2 nerves that take absurd and indirect routes through your torso for reasons that are essentially historical accident, generated by a rhythm-making circuit in the brainstem that nobody has fully mapped, possibly inherited from something that breathed water, possibly inherited from something that needed to burp while it fed, present in every mammal on Earth, present in you before your lungs had ever held air, treatable, mostly, by a collection of folk remedies arrived at by pure guesswork, which turn out to be quietly and accidentally correct. Occasionally, rarely, a message from somewhere deep in the body that something is wrong, and otherwise, just a small, undignified interruption that arrives without warning and leaves without explanation. Something you have done thousands of times, will do thousands more, and had never once, before tonight, thought to ask about. So what do you do with all of that? What is it actually for in the end? I think what I like about hiccups, and I do like them now, having spent this long with them, is how thoroughly they resist being important. We spend an enormous amount of effort explaining ourselves. Every part of the body gets assigned a function. Every behavior gets a reason. Every trait gets a story about why it was selected for and what advantage it conferred. And most of the time those stories are true, or true enough to be useful. But then there's this, something your body does regularly, has always done, will keep doing, that appears to be there for no reason at all, except that it was there before, and nobody removed it. Not a design, not a solution, just something left in the wiring, and bodies are full of that. If you look, consider the company it keeps. The muscles around your ears that in most people cannot move your ears at all, still present, still wired, still receiving instructions from a brain that has nothing to say to them. The goosebumps that rise on your arms when you're cold or moved, raising a coat of fur that you do not have and that your ancestors lost so long ago, that the mechanism now accomplishes precisely nothing except making your skin look strange. The reflex that curls a newborn's fingers tightly around anything placed in their palm. Strong enough, in the first days, that an infant can very nearly support their own weight by their grip. A hand-me-down from ancestors whose infants had to hold on to something that was moving. In a world where letting go was fatal, there's a whole quiet museum of it inside every person. Wisdom teeth arriving in a jaw that has no room for them. The small pointed fold at the inner corner of your eye, which in other animals is a third eyelid that sweeps across. The tailbone at the base of your spine, a handful of fused vertebrae that once continued outward and now simply stop. None of that is useful. All of it is still there. You are carrying a very old machine. Most of it has been updated. Some of it hasn't. And every so often, a piece of the old firmware runs, and you make a small sound, and you have absolutely no say in the matter. So as you lie there now, maybe still following this, maybe not, maybe just letting the sound of it go past you, here's what I'd like to leave you with. Underneath your ribs, that sheet of muscle is moving right now. Slowly, rhythmically, doing the same shape change it has done 600 million times without any input from you, without ever once being thanked. Notice it, if you like, just once, before you stop paying attention to anything. It has been doing that since before you were born, and for months before that, before there was any air to move, before your lungs were anything but fluid, it was already contracting on a rhythm, sending its small test signals down a cable that had only just been laid, checking that the connection held. It doesn't need you awake. It doesn't need you paying attention. It has never once asked permission, and it has never once stopped. Not for a single minute of your entire life. Not once, in all the years, through everything that has happened to you, has it paused to check whether you were managing. In a minute or two, it'll slow down a little, the way it always does when a person starts to drift, and the breaths will get longer and further apart, and you won't notice the moment that happens, because nobody ever does. And if, at some point tonight, it decides to jerk once, out of rhythm, for no reason at all, an old circuit briefly finding itself switched on, a message from something that swam, or from a version of you that was very small and needed to make a little more room for milk, then, well, it'll pass. It always passes. You don't have to do anything about it. You don't have to do anything about anything. Let the old machine run.